capital gains tax is one of those weird ones where for pretty much every other part of the tax system, I've got a clear idea of what the optimal approach is. For capital gains tax, I just see a wide variety of different compromises, all of which have their attractions and their drawbacks. I think in an ideal world, you probably just wouldn't tax capital gains at all. You would use a consumption base for taxation, so income would be taxed when it's consumed, not when it's made and not when it's invested, and that would be better for growth and for capital accumulation, for productivity and everything else.
Tom Clougherty, welcome to Australia and welcome to the IPA. So I hear it's your first time in Australia and first time in Melbourne, obviously. What are your first impressions?
Well, first impressions, and I'm not just being a good guest when I say this, it's a lovely, lovely city. I took a nice walk around yesterday trying to get rid of that jet lag, which is a bit of a killer. First time I've travelled this far, but it really is stunning. I love the Royal Botanic Gardens. The architecture is really cool. I wish I was staying longer. Hopefully you'll have me back sometime. Okay,
well, now for the serious questions, and just for our audience, you've been involved in think tank land in the UK and the US for many years. You've been head of the IEA, you've been head of the Adam Smith Institute, and your specialty is tax and more broadly economics. Now let's start with a broader economic question. So it's fair to say, I think, that in the Western world over the past 10, 20 years, growth has been fairly stagnant, certainly since the global financial crisis, I would say. So what do you see as the biggest problem there and you know, the most promising solution to boost growth around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ways you can think about this, right? And you can talk about frontier growth and you can talk about catch-up growth. And probably in the modern world, the US is at the frontier and they're the ones sort of making the technological breakthroughs, AI, big tech and everything. Now, if you speak to Americans, they're still pretty fed up that they're not growing as fast as they think they should be. But I don't think the rest of us, certainly not in Britain, should be thinking of ourselves in those American terms. We're not at the growth frontier. Really, what we should be thinking about is how can we catch up? And catching up is largely, I think, a case of getting out of our own way. There are so many ways in Britain, and I think this is true across a lot of developed, mature, liberal democracies, that we inhibit ourselves, whether it's through tax, whether it's through regulation, whatever. We keep getting in our own way, and it's leading to a kind of sclerosis and stagnation, which has all kinds of unfortunate side effects.
Yeah, there was this argument in the UK that when you left the EU that the economy would boom. That hasn't happened. And look, I don't know what side of that debate you were on, but it's fair to say it hasn't happened. Would things have been even worse if you'd stayed in the EU?
I mean, honestly, it's hard to say, right? I mean, institutions are important, and I think that there was a good case that if you left the EU, it would create the freedom to pursue different policies which could boost growth, particularly had we gone along this line of regulatory divergence. You know, Europe, for some reason, has decided to make its real specialty regulation. That's Europe's, and they'll actually say this, you know, our comparative advantage is we're a regulatory superpower. Well, great, but that's not delivering a lot of growth. So there was an opportunity there for Britain, but it's an opportunity that quite categorically we haven't taken. There has been no meaningful regulatory divergence whatsoever. We wasted years in politics arguing over what form of Brexit we would have. In a way, actually, we accepted a lot of pain and a much worse trade deal with the European Union than we could have because we wanted this freedom of movement to be able to deregulate, to be able to do things our own way. And we haven't used it. We haven't really even tried to use it. That was under the Conservatives. And now we've got a Labour government. They're heading in the other direction.
If you look at the Western world, it seems to me that the US is a special case. Its GDP per capita, income per capita seems to be moving away from Europe, the UK and Australia, you know, basically accelerating much further ahead. Now, there are various reasons for that, but would you say it's the regulatory settings in the US, and you know, by that I'm including taxation, basically everything, labour rules, that are the main reason for that, or something else?
And I think that's certainly part of it. And I think, although I'm kind of loath to rely on cultural explanations, but I think there probably is something of a cultural explanation there. It does seem like a more dynamic society, more entrepreneurial, more risk-taking in a way that often you feel in Britain. People are looking for a reason not to do things, or they're looking for a reason to say no, or to say this can't be done. America just seems to have this culture of getting on and doing it. That said, yes, they do have a different regulatory climate. They do have a kind of slightly better approach to taxation, although if you've ever filed a US tax return, you'll accept that there are a lot of problems there as well. One theory that I find quite compelling about this is one that was outlined by the US economist Tyler Goodspeed when he visited the Institute of Economics Affairs last year. And you know, his argument was that after the financial crisis, we introduced this whole new or much more strict method of financial regulation for the banks, and it's really constrained credit. And it's done that more or less everywhere. We're all bound by the same kind of international regulations, although there are differences in the way we implement them domestically. The funny thing is, though, in America, because they've got a big venture capital market, and because they've got a lot of small regional banks that can lend to businesses as well, not just a handful of big national banks, which are regulated at this systemically important, very conservative level, the businesses haven't been constrained in the same way there that they have been in the UK and that they have been in Europe. Now, I don't think that's the single cause of post-crisis stagnation, but I do think that it's quite an interesting indication of what might have gone wrong, specifically since 2008, because after all, we had bad tax systems before, we had bad housing policies before, the rise in energy prices really started a little bit before the financial crisis. So it's interesting to try and pinpoint that thing there.
Well, just on those bad tax systems, they're probably getting worse in some ways. So there's talk in Australia of trying to introduce a billionaires tax, certainly on the left of politics. Europe's already got some experience with those in France and in Norway, I believe. What's been the result of those taxes?
Well, they've generally failed. In fact, I shouldn't say generally. They've uniformly failed, probably with the exception of Switzerland. But as in so many other cases, Switzerland is a bit of a special case because they don't really have capital gains taxes. They don't really have inheritance taxes. They have a very different housing market from the rest of us and so on. And generally, the taxes are low anyway. And sometimes rich residents can just negotiate their own personal tax rates with the canton that they live in. So Switzerland is not really one that you should generalize from. Looking at the other countries that have had wealth taxes, most of them have found the same kind of things, that they don't raise much revenue, that they're an administrative nightmare, that they drive capital flight, that they inhibit investment and growth. We know this, and this is why most of the countries that had wealth taxes or have experimented with them have subsequently got rid of them. But we're going round again. There's barely a new idea in policy. That's one of the problems we have, I think. But this idea has returned. There's a big push for it in Britain as well from the radical left. And the radical left is unfortunately a growing force in British politics, partly because of the weakness of the centre-left, partly because politics in Britain, as in many other cases, is kind of realigning from a two-party system into a bloc system, where people are shifting between different parties of the right and different parties of the left. And there is a little bit of a flight to purity there, if you like. So the incentive on the left is, can we go left? Can we go further left? These ideas crop up again and again. And that's very dangerous. I don't think anyone in the government in Britain at the moment is crazy enough to go there, although they do kind of hint at it from time to time to shore up their left flank. But I think there is a danger if the left wins the next election, something further left, or if we get the right and then they fail to deal with any of the big problems we've had, or fail again, perhaps I should say, we then get a sort of radical left government, and all this kind of thing is then on the table.
That flight to purity phrase I like, and certainly in relation to income tax. If you go back to the original formulation, I think Haig-Simons from memory, you're supposed to pay income tax not just on your receipts, but actually your unrealised capital gains. And that appears to be happening, at least in the Netherlands, and actually it almost happened here. They've introduced, I believe, a 36% tax on unrealised capital gains in the Netherlands. So where is this kind of idea coming from? It's not really a wealth tax per se, but it's a somewhat obscure and I'd say very wrong-headed way of taxing capital gains.
Yeah, and there was kind of a push for this under Biden in the US as well. So this is, again, one of those ideas which you see a lot in the academic tax literature, but has generally been avoided in real life because it's just very difficult to apply fairly. I mean, after all, a huge amount of assets, they don't trade regularly. How do you value them for these purposes, and what kind of effect is it going to have on people's liquidity and whether they have to constantly dilute their stakes in businesses and so on to comply with taxes? Again, I think it's an idea which is maybe elegant in theory, but nightmarish in practice. Now, I know something funny is going on in the Netherlands, and I haven't really kept entirely on top of it, but I think basically they had one regime that was ruled unlawful for some reason, and then this thing is coming in as a substitute, and no one's really happy about it, and they're already seeing some of the likely ill effects. But equally, there's some kind of weird political blockage where they can't get it sorted out in time, so this thing is going to come into force. It's not something that has really been talked about a lot in the UK. But if you just want to kind of dwell on the economic theory there for a minute, one of the big problems with capital gains taxes is this lock-in effect, so-called. And the idea is basically You're holding an asset and you hold it for longer than is optimal. You might sell it and realize the gain, reinvest in something else. That might be a more efficient allocation of capital. That might be better than growth, but you don't do it because of the tax system, because you think, well, I'll hold on to this asset, maybe because a future government will cut the capital gains tax rate, or maybe they'll introduce some new allowance or exemption, or in most countries, when you die, historic capital gains are wiped out. And the assets may be subject to inheritance tax, but that may be more advantageous for your heirs and so on. So taxing unrealized gains is a way of trying to get around that lock-in effect. And again, sounds plausible in theory. In practice, I think it breaks down very, very quickly.
Yeah, well, that's actually a very relevant comment to Australia, where the government here is considering changing the capital gains tax regime. We currently have this somewhat strange system whereby if an asset is held for more than 12 months, there is a 50% discount on the nominal gain, and then you just pay tax at your normal rates. But they're considering to reduce the discount from 50% to 33%, so obviously it'd be a lower reduction, an increase in tax. They think they're going to raise more revenue from this, but what would you say?
Well, I think, capital gains tax is one of those weird ones where for pretty much every other part of the tax system, I've got a clear idea of what the optimal approach is. For capital gains tax, I just see a wide variety of different compromises, all of which have their attractions and their drawbacks. I think in an ideal world, you probably just wouldn't tax capital gains at all. You would use a consumption base for taxation, so income would be taxed when it's consumed, not when it's made and not when it's invested, and that would be better for growth and for capital accumulation and for productivity and everything else. A lot of people say, though, that because there's a slightly porous boundary between ordinary earnings and capital gains, that gives people too much opportunity to try and cheat the tax system. So in a way, even for quite reasonable tax experts, capital gains tax is just a sort of compromise that you have to have for practical reasons, but it's hard to come up with a kind of pure theoretical case for it that works. And Britain has experimented with pretty much every version of capital gains tax over the years. I think we had, before kind of the big tax reform in the late 1980s, by Nigel Lawson under the Thatcher government, we had kind of preferential rates for capital gains. Well, in fact, you call them preferential. Actually, you had a super tax on capital gains at one point. It went up to 98% on so-called unearned income. You didn't have indexation for inflation, and of course this was an era of quite high inflation. Yes. From the 80s through until probably the 2000s, you had the same rates as for ordinary income, but you had indexation. And you also, they had wiped out any gains before some particular year in the 1980s. So all of those previous inflationary gains were wiped out. So at the time, this was quite a popular reform with people in the investment world and so on. Gordon Brown changed that. He got rid of indexation. He introduced something called taper relief. So rather than having indexation to inflation, you would effectively have indexation to time. Okay. So that the longer you held the asset, the lower the effective tax rate on it would be. Alistair Darling, his successor as Chancellor, probably late 2000s, then thought, well, this is all just a complicated mess. We'll just have a single flat rate on all capital gains and leave it at that. So I think he wanted to do 15%. He ended up with 18%. But then there was a problem because lots of entrepreneurs who were relying on selling their businesses, let's say, and retiring would have experienced a big tax increase. So then they immediately added in some more complications, entrepreneurs relief for one. Sorry, this is probably a huge amount of detail for an Australian audience that they might not be interested in.
I think the question that I do want to know is that where it still is, 18% flat rate, no indexation?
No, still no indexation, but now we have a couple of rates.
Okay.
And at one point we had different rates depending on what kind of assets they were. Now it's mostly different rates depending on where you fall in the income spectrum.
Okay.
But a couple of rates, they are lower than the income tax rates. Okay. They're not indexed to inflation.
Interesting. Okay. Well, still a better system than we have. Just moving on to another tax, stamp duty, or transfers on shares and property. We don't have them on shares anymore in Australia, but certainly I think we have the highest transfers on property in the world. Now you have those two in the UK. I don't think quite as bad, but
I don't know. I thought ours was worse.
Really?
Yeah. Well, we can fight over this one later.
But certainly in theory, a land tax would be much, much better. And yet we don't have land tax. We have high stamp duty. So firstly, do you see stamp duties as being particularly bad? And then I guess the more general question: why do we end up with these such terrible tax systems?
Yeah. So stamp duty, I think, worse. It's what we call it, the property transaction tax. Do you call it stamp duty as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the worst tax on the statute books in the UK, I think, by far. It has an extremely damaging effect. And I imagine it's kind of similar in Australia, right? Because the big problem with taxes on transactions is that at the margin, they deter those transactions from happening. If you deter transactions at the margin, you end up with property being held not by the people who value it the most highly. So this is wildly inefficient in basic economic terms. Now, if you had abundant housing, if you didn't have supply constraints, exactly how that housing was allocated wouldn't be quite so important. When you have a market which is very tightly constrained, allocation is everything. So you combine in Britain, and I guess you combine in Australia as well, quite strict planning or zoning laws which restrict housing quite significantly. Then you have very heavy property transaction taxes which deter people from moving and mean you get people living in properties which are probably unsuitable for them, probably not the properties they would choose, all things being equal in a free market, and other people struggling to get on the housing ladder at all. This is a huge and very costly and very growth destroying distortion that we have, and we should just get rid of it. The problem is in Britain, it's become so lucrative for the government. So you go back 20, 30 years, stamp duty was not a particularly significant tax. It was a sort of 1% tax on the capital value over a certain threshold.
For property and shares?
Yeah, well, so the share thing works differently. We have stamp duty on shares as well. Still?
Really? I don't think we do.
It's a minor tax, and there are actually several varieties of it, and it doesn't apply, I think, for example, to like mutual funds or ETFs, only to direct shareholdings. Depends on the way you buy them, exactly how it applies. Even there, I've looked at it in the past, and we've had modelling done on it, and it shows that it's probably the one, the main tax where there's just a very obvious Laffer effect. You could get rid of it and lose no revenue. Revenues might even increase because you'd be gaining more from corporation tax, from capital gains tax and everything else. So just scrap those. But they're a small amount of revenue, a fairly minor part of the tax system. On property, it's a huge problem. And in the old days when you didn't raise too much from it, I think you could have got rid of it or you could have transitioned quite easily. Now, you're thinking unless you're prepared to cut spending in quite a significant way, how do you make up that revenue?
What sort of percentages are we talking? Say someone buys a £500,000 home in the UK.
Well, sort of the standard rate is around 5%.
Okay.
Over a threshold, and the threshold is relatively high now. I think the big difference maybe is that the Conservative government in the 2010s decided to make stamp duty progressive. Progressive, on the basis of property value. So it goes all the way up to 12% for high value properties.
Wow.
You then have a 3% surcharge if it's an additional home, so if it's not your primary residence. If you're not ordinarily UK resident, add another 3% on. So a wealthy foreigner buying a house in London is probably being stung with an 18% marginal rate on a very significant share of that property's value. Now, world's smallest violins and everything may not be shedding many tears for plutocrats buying mansions in London, but nevertheless, these are quite high rates. And, they kind of killed the top end of the London property market as a result. Maybe costing them...
Big falls recently, I believe.
Big fall. What's going on in the property market in Britain is weird because we're really failing massively to build any more houses. We have vastly fewer housing units per person than other European countries. We have a huge backlog of unmet demand, whether it's immigration or whether it's just from standard population growth. And yet, in recent years, property price increases have eased off. And in London, particularly for flats or apartments, they seem to have dipped. And that's in nominal terms. When you look at the course of inflation recently, that's all the more severe. But there are some weird regulatory things going on as well as the impact of higher interest rates on mortgage payments, which are maybe having some effect there. The basic point is housing hasn't become any more abundant. It hasn't really become more affordable, even if those nominal prices have come down. I mean, maybe if you're a wealthy cash buyer, that's one thing. But for most of us, it hasn't really changed the fundamental calculation.
Just on the housing issue, there's this argument out there that there's something with the common law countries, the English-speaking countries, that makes our property particularly expensive. And I think that's probably true. If you compare to France and Germany, say, they don't have the same sort of problem, I believe, that we have. Is there any truth to that argument? Is there something with the English-speaking countries that bids up the value of property?
I mean, it does seem that way, doesn't it? If you look at most of the English-speaking countries do have this problem. But then again, I don't think you can say, well, this is strictly because, well, certainly not not because we speak English, right? And I don't think it's necessarily because of common law systems, because you can look at the US and they have both experiences. Obviously, it's a vast country, but you have places where you have very tight housing constraints and very high prices. Then you have places like Texas, where Austin, you've had massive economic boom, loads of people moving into the city, lots of growth, and yet rents, I think, have come down because supply is so elastic, right? It responds to demand in a way that in most places it can't. Now, they speak English, they have a common law system.
Yes, exactly.
So it's more about the specific regulatory approach that we take. But I think there's an issue here, and it's maybe it's generalizable more widely to our current malaise, I think. That we've ended up with a system where there's widespread bureaucratic discretion and where there are just so many different veto players and interest groups and potential blockers who can just prevent anything from happening in a wide variety of ways. It applies to housing, energy, transport infrastructure, you name it. We are stuck quite fundamentally.
Just briefly on the Texan model that you mentioned, truly, no income tax there, at least at the state level,
Right.
and very high property taxes, not land taxes. I believe it's on the full value of the property.
Yeah.
But that said, is that still a better system, say, than what we have in the UK and Australia? You know, you have much higher property taxes, and much lower income tax.
In my view, it's a better system, although when you look at how much we raise from property taxes in the UK in total, so if you include the transaction taxes, stamp duty, if you include business rates, which is our ongoing tax on business property, council tax, which is sort of the residential property tax, doesn't really amount to much, although even so, it's exceptionally unpopular, probably the least popular tax, along with inheritance tax in the UK. Put those all together and you're raising quite a lot of revenue. I think it's the most as a percentage of GDP anywhere in the OECD. Maybe it's the second most. There's a couple of other countries that sometimes vie with us for that top spot. So what I take away from that is that you could structure property taxes in a much better, much more pro-growth way in the UK. And that would probably mean shifting over time from transaction taxes to recurrent property taxes, and ideally trying to base those recurrent property taxes on land values rather than capital values for the economic effects your listeners will probably be familiar with. But I don't think you can raise more revenue. You can't use that, I think, as a rebalancing of the tax system to cut the big income taxes. We're just not in that kind of scenario in the UK.
Yeah, you mentioned inheritance tax, and I really should ask you about what is the lay of the land on that globally. Obviously, you've got considerable wealth in the boomer generation, I guess, and there's some people on the left who say this is a perfect opportunity to increase inheritance tax, but my understanding is empirically countries are moving away from it, or at least they're lowering their rates. Certainly that's the case in the US, not quite sure about the UK. Firstly, what is happening? And secondly, do you think it's a good tax? This is something that divides economists. You've got John Stuart Mills on one side, I guess, James Buchanan too, were in favour, and then of course you've got most conservative economists very against it. So, what would you say?
I mean, I think it's a bad tax fundamentally, and I'm going to forget the exact statistic. This may be jet lag kicking in, but for it raises a vanishingly small percentage of overall revenue, but it accounts for a big chunk of the tax code in the UK, and I suspect there's probably a similar phenomenon in other countries that levy inheritance tax. And the reason for that is it gets incredibly complicated because nobody wants to pay it. There is a huge industry in the UK of schemes for trying to avoid inheritance tax. Now, I'm not talking about illegal tax evasion, but different investment strategies or asset portfolios and stuff which try and minimise your tax liability.
What's the broad outline of it? Just to pause you there, what is the rate? And
right. So we've got a single rate of inheritance tax, which is 40%.
Okay, well,
it can apply retrospectively to gifts given within 7 years of death on kind of a sliding scale. If you got something 6 years ago, a relatively lower rate. If you got something 1 year ago from a deceased relative, pretty close to that headline 40% rate. Now, we do have a fairly generous allowance, so a lot of households actually won't face it when it comes to it. I think the standard rate is about £325,000.
Including the home?
Well, so this is where it gets complicated. No. So you have an individual allowance, but then you can, if you give everything to your spouse can then inherit your allowance as well. And then you have an additional allowance when you're leaving a primary residence to a direct descendant, so a child or grandchild. So if you roll this all up together, for many estates where you have, let's say, a wife whose husband has predeceased her, and there's a house which is then being left to children or grandchildren, the long and short of it is you end up with a threshold of about £1 million and a rate of about 40%, and a variety of other complications around that as well. Now, arguably, you'd be better off with a much lower rate and a sort of broader base, but again, that would bring more people into the net and they would really resent it. The fundamental thing, I think, here is not so much an economic question, although I think there are massive deadweight costs to levying inheritance tax, so there is an economic side to this, but it's more a moral or a philosophical one. I just don't think that most people will regard their own property as being distinct from their parents' property or their children's property. We tend to think of these things as families, and we see it as unjust when the state tries to insert itself into those kind of intergenerational or interfamily wealth transfers, or intra-family wealth transfers. I think people just think it's wrong. Even people who are probably never going to pay inheritance tax, it offends their sense of moral justice. And for the amount of hassle it creates and the relatively small amount of revenue it generates, to me, this is just a simple case of let's get rid of it.
Just on tax still, what are the big tax issues in the UK right now, the UK political media class? What are people talking about changing, wanting to change? Certainly in Australia, it's capital gains tax. That's the big one, maybe minerals taxes on gas, etc. But, what are the big issues in the UK right now?
I think the big issue at the moment is probably around personal income taxes. So since the current Labour government came in 2024. So they raised payroll tax quite significantly, what we call employers' national insurance contributions. They both broadened the base by having it kick in at a lower wage level, and they increased the rate that it was charged at. This has had a fairly predictable effect on employment, especially for young people, and especially for the lowest waged earners who maybe, and it always sounds harsh to say this, but their productivity doesn't merit a wage at the level of the minimum. So we've had a big increase in the minimum wage as well, so that's corresponded with it. So you've got the minimum wage kicking in, and then you've got high payroll taxes on that as well. It's just making low-paid and inexperienced workers too expensive. So you're getting more unemployment or fewer people joining the workforce in the first place. And we had this long-running saga last summer. Where, and I don't know how familiar your listeners will be to this, but we have something called the Office for Budget Responsibility. We have a set of fiscal rules, and chancellors are always telling us how much headroom they have against their fiscal rules. And the fiscal rules are kind of a bit of a nonsense because it all depends on hitting an arbitrary target 3 to 5 years in the future. So based on forecasts which always turn out to be wrong. Nevertheless, they like to cut it as fine as they can. Not surprising, they are politicians after all. But it became clear because the economy was deteriorating, because tax revenues weren't as strong as the government had anticipated, even though they just raised taxes quite significantly in their first budget, it looked for most of last year like there were going to have to be another big wave of tax increases at the budget in the autumn in order to make the fiscal sums add up. And we had endless debate, back and forth, really confidence sapping and probably growth destroying in its own way that we were just talking about this. And yet taxes went up a little bit, but it turned out to be a bit of a damn squib overall. But I think everybody now is thinking, and they're not wrong to think this, when a tax is going to go up again. Because the economy isn't getting any better, the deficit isn't really closing, and I think people recognise that for all of the talk on the left about taxing the rich or taxing unfavoured businesses or whatever, if you want to raise big amounts of revenue, it's going to have to come from income tax, national insurance, or VAT on ordinary people. There's another thing which is becoming much more severe in Britain's income tax system as well, which is important to highlight, which is that over the years we've created, through bad tax design and often just very short-sighted cynicism on budget day, a series of tax traps in the tax system where the effective marginal tax rate just spikes massively. And so probably the biggest example of this, although there are others, is at the £100,000 mark. So when you get to £100,000, your personal allowance, the tax-free threshold, starts to be withdrawn. So for every £2 you earn over 100,000, you lose £1 of your personal allowance. What this means is that the income tax in that band of income isn't 40%, like it says on the tin. It's actually 60%.
Yeah.
And you've also got other things, like you lose all childcare subsidies at 100,000. Childcare is extremely expensive. You can be in a situation, if you've got a couple of kids under 5 in London and you're earning 100,000, you pretty much have to earn 150,000 before you'd be better off because of the tax system. So lots of people trying to
So
avoid
no one
this.
earns that amount, I assume. Well, there's
Well,
this
no,
big
no one who can help
Yes,
it. Yes, you can look at the distribution of taxpayers, and there's a sudden spike of people earning 99,000, and then it drops down again.
Yes.
I think that these more people are going because we've frozen tax thresholds during a period where we've had high inflation, so lots more people are finding themselves in this tax trap, and it's becoming a more significant political issue over time. And I think it's also becoming a much more significant growth issue as well. If you create these strong incentives for people not to increase their earnings, especially when they're quite highly productive people for the most part, this is going to have a negative long-run economic effect.
Now, just on your experience at think tanks over many years, and we've been talking about all the problems with our tax systems. Sensible think tanks like ours, we like to argue for sensible taxes, but it's fair to say it's not. We haven't necessarily had huge success. I mean, have there been any purple patches in history where think tanks have had large success in the UK or elsewhere? And what lessons have you learned from your long experience there on trying to influence policy?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and I wish there was more I could draw from in my direct personal experience to tell other people how they could do it. But actually, I've had have I had the misfortune to be a think tanker in a period where it's been very hard to have that kind of impact, or have I been doing something wrong? Have all of us been doing something wrong? I do think that there is a degree to which, I'll speak for myself here, mistakes have been made over the years, and looking back you can see how maybe I would have had more influence if I was making this argument earlier, or if I had approached this particular problem in a different way. I think that the free market right in general around the world has been slow to come to terms with the emergence of a very complicated regulatory state. And this was something that in Britain we kind of invented by accident. And in a way, Margaret Thatcher was the one that established the modern regulatory state, partly as a step in the privatization process. Partly, in some cases, it was centralizing and regulating something with a view to privatizing it later. Sometimes it was just you're trying to create a market where one didn't exist before, so you'd set up a regulator with that purpose. You establish these institutions, and unfortunately, the idea was that they would wither away over time as they became unnecessary. That didn't happen. And then you got governments with quite different governing philosophies coming into power in the 2000s, Tony Blair in particular, and taking what were quite narrow economic remits and layering on top of them social and environmental objectives. And so this sort of secondary state, if you like, this regulatory state or administrative state or bureaucratic state, whatever you want to call it, has grown and grown and grown. It's become more and more complex. Its tentacles have spread into almost every facet of economic life, and that's had a huge problem. And I think perhaps had we been more aware of that, and sharper on the uptake about what was going on earlier, we could have fought back against it. Similarly, I think in the 2000s, before the financial crisis, when growth seemed to be kind of taken for granted, and low inflation, I think that the free market right didn't abandon its sort of sound macroeconomic principles, but didn't talk about them enough. It kind of deprioritized public spending and tax reform and shifted into other important areas like public service reform and that kind of thing. But again, I think it let the centre-left get away with too much. There have been a few successes I've had. They're quite particular to the British experience. I won't dwell on them here. But I think when you look back at history, certainly in Britain, think tanks had a huge impact in the IEA, where I used to be the director in the 1960s and the 1970s, in really developing the ideas which turned into Thatcherism. I guess first keeping them alive during a very difficult period, and then secondly, popularizing them. And then that spread to other think tanks like the Centre for Policy Studies, which was much more politically focused, like the Adam Smith Institute. I've worked at both of those, where it was more about trying to kind of engineer the policies that politicians and civil servants would then be able to implement. I think in a way, the lesson I draw when I look at that experience and I think about maybe some of the ways we've fallen short today, it's kind of a free market lesson, right? That specialization is good, and comparative advantage is good. And when I look at that policy policy think tank landscape that was very successful in the 1970s and then to some degree produced the 1980s and the 1990s, although you did need the people as well. You needed your Margaret Thatchers and you needed events to conspire in your favour. But when I look at that, you had people who were doing the kind of pure academic research, and they were, in a sense, trying to discover new truths and educate people about them. You had the political popularizers who were taking those ideas and trying to build coalitions and trying to win political support for them. And then you had, if you like, the engineers who were taking these big ideas and taking the constituency you'd built to support them and working out, okay, how exactly do I turn this into an implementable policy? And I think one of the problems maybe, and I'm only speaking for Britain because, of course, the IPA is a paragon of virtue in all of these respects. But I think the policy landscape has become a little bit too homogenous, where we all try and do the same thing.
Well, just on the IPA, I think one success we have had recently, certainly, is on the energy front. I think we've managed to convince a large enough share of the political class that it's a stupid policy, net zero by 2050, and 2 of our major parties have dumped it, or actually you might say 3 now with One Nation, given its rise. Of course, the Labor Party has not, nor the Greens, and they're in government. But in the UK, I see you're far further down the net zero path. I would say with fairly devastating consequences. Why is that? Is that because there wasn't enough pushback from think tanks? They were more captured by the renewable energy zeitgeist? What is it?
Yeah, it's a combination of those things. And funnily enough, yes, it was always the stated intention of the British government, Conservative and Labour, to be in the vanguard of the fight against climate change and net zero. Net zero is a crazy thing. Now, it isn't the be all and end all of British environmental policy because the building blocks have been put in place long before that, and we already had quite strict environmental rules, and we were heading towards a pretty significant degree of decarbonisation, at least. That was what the regulation said we were doing. But net zero was rushed through Parliament basically so we could get rid of Theresa May as Prime Minister quicker. She wanted a legacy and her party decided to give her one. And so this incredible economy-wide piece of legislation binding us to net zero carbon emissions in 2050 went through with virtually no debate. There were a few brave people who stood up and said, no, this is wrong. And I think the Treasury at the time tried to resist it because they could see, at least looking at it in economic terms, what the costs would be. But what this tells you is that this was, in some senses, not a serious undertaking by people who had deeply researched about it and weighed up the trade-offs and thought up deeply about how it would work. This was all about signalling. It was about signalling a kind of political virtue. It was about creating a legacy for politicians after they left office. And all the worse for that. Now, funnily enough, I think maybe the way that we're going to be most in the vanguard is not by persuading other people that they should adopt the same net zero policies and impoverish themselves, basically, for the sake of reducing global emissions by some tiny fraction of a percent.
Exactly.
Actually, what we're going to show to the rest of the world is if you run too fast on this stuff, you store up a massive backlash. And people might sign up and smile and nod to the environmental agenda when times are good and incomes are rising and prices are stable. But as soon as any of those conditions fall by the wayside, you are going to get a backlash. And we're starting to see that. Of course, we have a centre-left government at the moment. We have an environment minister who is very committed to all of this stuff.
Obsessed, I would say.
Obsessed. So you're not really seeing policy change yet, but I think you are seeing the mood and the debate shift quite dramatically. And I think, depending on the way the next election goes, you could see very significant change very quickly.
Look, final question on the Donald Trump phenomenon and I guess political philosophy here. So, certainly some would say his effect on the right globally has been a cataclysm. It's destroyed a lot of traditional parties, the Conservatives in the UK, possibly the Liberal Party in Australia. Conservatives in Canada have suffered greatly. Others would, of course, say it's a wonderful development. It's getting back to its roots, etc. Certainly on the energy front, he's made a lot of space to criticise energy policy. The US is now pursuing a different route. So I think we'd probably agree on that front. He's been a plus. But more generally, do you think he's been a force for good or bad on the right of politics in the world?
I think he's been a force for bad generally. and force for bad on the right in politics as well. I think that you can distinguish first-term Trump from second-term Trump. And when you look at the first term, there was a lot of stuff that I can understand why it wound people up. His personal style is not for everyone. I think we all know what that's about. But at the same time, they did tax reform, which to most free market tax people seemed pretty good, more by omission than commission. They did some good regulatory stuff. And when I say more by omission than commission, a lot of the progress they made was not through positive reforms or removals of regulation, but by just not filling, maybe because they couldn't fill a lot of the positions in the administration for the people who had introduced new regulations and stuff. You had, I think, for the most part, very good judicial appointments and so on. At the same time, the trade policy was pretty disastrous even in the first term. Spending was out of control. I think second term, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think there's very little to like and there's an awful lot to worry about. I do agree, I'm glad that things have shifted on the environmental policy front, but I'm not sure it's a worthwhile trade-off. Now, looking at the global right, I think there are clearly very specific instances like Canada where it was Donald Trump that had a direct knock-on effect on domestic politics there. I think that's overblown, certainly in Britain, I suspect in other countries as well. I think what we're seeing, although obviously you can draw comparisons and parallels with Donald Trump in America, and Trump himself called Boris Johnson Britain Trump, and there was a big tendency in America, I was living there at the time, to conflate Brexit with Trumpism. But I think they're both responses to a broader realignment in politics. And my former colleague at the Institute of Economics Affairs, Steve Davies, has been writing about this for years. And at first I didn't really believe him, and then I didn't want to believe him, and now I just think he's more and more prescient, and it makes me more and more worried about where we're going politically and what the right is going to end up looking like. But the idea here basically is that we're no longer aligned around economic issues. Economic issues are still important, but they're not what define people's political identity anymore. It's not market versus state. It's not tax and spend versus small government. More and more politics is aligned around cultural issues or issues of national identity. And so what you're seeing emerge is a very different right and potentially, although I think they're behind on this, a very different left. And it remains to be seen where that's going to go. I don't particularly counsel despair on this, right? I think when you look at the British right, clearly there is a short-term political problem there because we have a first-past-the-post voting system, and you have one party of the right on 20% and another party of the right on 30%. Now, they could together win a massive landslide majority, or they could split the vote in a way that even if actually they are by far the biggest political bloc by votes, they don't win and the left gets in. So that's a clear and present danger. There's also a danger that a kind of right emerges which isn't very free market, which is quite authoritarian and doesn't really reflect certainly my political values and priorities. But that being said, I think you have a Conservative Party in Britain which is fairly free market and fairly sensible on the culture stuff. And Reform, I think, are pretty free market and fairly sensible on the culture stuff. Neither of them is going off the deep end. Neither of them, I think, are still clinging to the kind of soggy centrist establishment politics that maybe defined the Tories' previous period in government or a large part of it. So there's hope there. But I tend not to think of this, to answer your question directly, as Donald Trump and his knock-on effect on the rest of the world. That's a little bit too America-brained for my taste. I think what we do have is big shifts in society and big shifts in culture, and politics is responding to those, and it's shaking up the kaleidoscope, and we don't really know where these different political movements are going to end up or precisely what their characteristics are going to be. The job for people like me, and I suspect, Adam, for people like you as well in our institutions, is to try and make sure that whatever emerges on the right probably is free market and individualist and believes in freedom.
I'll just ask one more question with a brief answer, if I may.
Yeah.
I have to ask about the UK. If you talk to people on the right in Australia, and we pay more attention to the UK perhaps than other countries because of historical reasons, obviously a lot of fondness for Britain, they will say things like, Britain's gone, it's over, it's a disaster, we don't want to be like that. So I guess my question to you is, what would you say to them? What's something to ease their despondence, when they say things like that? Is there something? I hope so, because I want to get a positive note.
Well, Adam, Adam Smith said it, didn't he? There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. And I think things are bad. There's no doubt about that. But I also don't think that things are truly dire or that things are irrecoverable. You know, I look at Britain and I still see enormous potential in a whole host of different ways. And we just have to get out of our own way. That's the fundamental thing. I think if you fix energy policy, you fix housing policy, you probably make a few changes to financial regulation, relax the labour laws, go back to where we were 10 years ago, and do a little bit of tax reform. Short term, I think that we can turn things around pretty well. We'll still be faced with a longer term challenge around an ageing population and everything, which is going to really confront most of us as time goes by, and that's a harder one to deal with. But no, I don't think it's over for Britain by any stretch of the imagination. We just need good policies.
Okay, all right. Well, that's what we are here for. Tom, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.